Chapter 13. A Young Man Changed. Elizabeth's excitement was very high as she watched for the first appearance of Pemberley Woods. Finally, they turned toward the house. The park was very large and had a great variety of trees and plants. They entered it at one of its lowest points and drove for some time through a beautiful wood. Slowly, about half a mile, they were at the top of a hill. The wood stopped here, and their eyes were instantly caught by Pemberley House. It was located on the opposite side of a valley. It was a large, handsome stone building that stood on high ground and was backed by high woody hills. A river ran in front of it, with trees lined on its banks. Elizabeth was delighted. At that moment she thought what it would be like to be the mistress of Pemberley. She thought it would indeed be something to be proud of. They came down the hill and drove to the door. When they asked to see the place, they were let into the hall. The housekeeper came. She was a respectable-looking elderly lady who was more polite than Elizabeth had expected. They followed her into the dining room. It was a large room with handsome furniture. From its windows, the hill, upon which were many trees, was very beautiful. All the rooms in the house had high ceilings. This added to the beauty of the house. The furniture and decorations had great style, and from every window there were beauties to be seen. Elizabeth really wanted to ask the housekeeper whether the master was really absent, but she was not brave enough. Finally, her uncle asked her if the master was present. The servant, Mrs. Reynolds, replied that he was not, but then added, "But we expect him tomorrow with a party of friends."
"Is your master here at Pemberley much of the year?"
Mr. Gardiner asked. "Not so much as I could wish, sir. If he were to marry, you might see more of him," suggested Mrs. Gardiner. "Yes, madam, but I don't know when this will happen. I do not know who is good enough for him." Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner smiled. Elizabeth said, "I'm sure your opinion of him makes him respect you very much." "I say no more than what is true," replied the servant. "He is the best landlord and the best master that ever lived. There is not one of his servants that will complain about him. Some people call him proud, but I don't think I've ever seen him this way." "Can this be the same Mr. Darcy?" Elizabeth wondered. They entered the picture room. Here there were many paintings of the family, and Elizabeth stopped in front of a particular painting. It was a painting that looked like Mr. Wickham, and it was hung among several other pictures. The housekeeper approached Elizabeth and told her that it was not a picture of someone related to the family. Instead, it was the picture of a young gentleman who had been brought up by her late master. The late master had used his own money in raising the child. "That man is now in the army," she added, "but I am afraid that his character has turned out to be very wild." Elizabeth walked on to look for another face that she knew. Finally, she stopped in front of a painting that looked like Mr. Darcy. She stood looking at it for many minutes, and then she returned to it again before they left the gallery. Having seen all parts of the house that were open to the public, they thanked the housekeeper and said goodbye. Then the gardener met them to show them the grounds around the house. As they walked through the garden towards the river, Elizabeth turned to look back. She saw Mr. Darcy approaching from another road that led to where the horses were kept. His appearance was so sudden that it was impossible to miss him. Their eyes instantly met, and both of their cheeks became deep red. He stood, not moving from surprise. Then he came forward and spoke to Elizabeth calmly and politely. Both Mrs. Gardiner and her husband stood a little away while they were talking. Elizabeth, who was surprised and confused, could hardly lift her eyes to look at his face. She was hardly able to answer all the questions which he asked about her family. Finally, after standing a few moments without saying a word, he bowed to her and said goodbye. Her aunt and uncle then joined her and told her they greatly admired his appearance. But Elizabeth herself could not hear a word. She felt both ashamed and worried. She thought he would consider her most strange, as if she had come to Pemberley on purpose. Oh, why did she come? She asked herself. Or, why had he come back a day before he was expected, and his behavior and manner was so different than before? What could it mean? She was amazed that he had even decided to speak to her, but to speak with such politeness, to ask after her family. Never had she heard him speak with such gentleness as on this unexpected meeting. Then they entered a beautiful walk by the side of the river. Soon they were again surprised by the sight of Mr. Darcy approaching. He asked Elizabeth if she would introduce him to her friends. He stated that it would be his honor. He began a conversation with Mr. Gardiner and started to accompany them back to the house. Elizabeth felt quite pleased. She wanted Darcy to know that she had some relations which were not as embarrassing as her mother and younger sisters. She felt pride every time her uncle showed his intelligence and good manners. The party stopped to look at some unusual water plants, and Mrs. Gardiner took her husband's arm. Mr. Darcy then took his place beside Elizabeth, and they walked on together. After a short silence, Elizabeth told him that she had been told that he would not be there when they came to Pemberley. He explained that business had brought him ahead of the party that was arriving the next day.
Mr. Bingley and his sisters will come,
he said. Elizabeth answered only by making a slight bow.
There is another person in the party that arrives tomorrow,
he continued after a short while,
whom I should like you to meet. Will you allow me to introduce my sister to you while you are staying at Lambton?
Elizabeth was very surprised at his request. She felt he was quite generous. It was good to know that her earlier bad feelings toward him had not made him think wrongly of her. Elizabeth was both flattered and pleased. When they reached their carriage, Darcy politely asked them to come inside the house for some tea. However, they did not accept this offer because they wished to reach Lambton before dark. They left Mr. Darcy with much politeness. When the carriage drove off, Elizabeth turned and saw him walking slowly towards the house. Her uncle and aunt began to speak about the good feelings they had toward Mr. Darcy. They felt that he was a man of good manners and attentiveness. Elizabeth herself felt that she liked him better than ever before. Elizabeth had arranged with Darcy that he would bring his sister to visit her the day after the party reached Pemberley. But instead, these visitors arrived the very next morning. When the introduction took place, Elizabeth saw to her surprise that Miss Darcy was almost as embarrassed as she was. She had heard from Wickham that Miss Darcy was very proud. Instead, she found that Miss Darcy was extremely shy. She was taller than Elizabeth and less handsome than her brother, but her face was full of good humor and her manners were gentle. They had not been together very long before Darcy told her that Bingley was also coming to join them. Soon they heard footsteps on the stair, and Bingley entered the room. All of Elizabeth's anger went away once she saw him, and she was once again surprised by his friendliness. He asked her about her family, and looked and spoke with the same good humor that he had always done. She could not be fooled by his behavior toward Miss Darcy. There was nothing between them that showed they had any special feelings for each other. When the others were talking together, he told Elizabeth that it was a very long time since he had had the pleasure of seeing her. Before she could reply, he added,
It is about 8 months. We have not met since the 26th of November, when we were all dancing together at Netherfield.
It pleased her to see that his memory was so exact. After waiting a moment, Bingley asked whether all of her sisters were at Longbourn. Though it was a simple question, Elizabeth understood the special meaning behind it. When everyone was ready to leave, Mr. Darcy and his sister expressed their wish of having Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner and Miss Bennet to dinner at Pemberley. it was decided that they would meet for dinner the day after the next. When the visitors had gone, Elizabeth thought that their visit had been one of great satisfaction. She wanted to be alone because she was fearful of questions from her uncle and aunt. She stayed with them only long enough to hear that they thought most highly of Bingley. Her thoughts were of Pemberley all that evening. The evening was not long enough for her to decide how she felt about Darcy. Her hatred toward him had disappeared long ago, and she now felt ashamed about ever disliking him. Above all, she felt very grateful, not because he had once loved her, but because he loved her enough to forgive the way that she had not accepted his offer. He might have tried to avoid meeting her, but it seemed, on this accidental meeting, that he wanted to keep the friendship. Indeed, he tried to make her relations have a good opinion of him, and he wanted to introduce her to his sister. She wondered how much happiness it would bring to both of them if she were to encourage his feelings of love for her.